until when did you end up making the investment in Facebook? And can you tell us the backstory of like kind of how that happened? Because that's something that, I'm curious to hear, because it's one of the best investments kind of in history. And I'd love to hear kind of more about how that all unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, it was about late 2004, and yes, it was it was still sort of in the bad hangover of the dot-com experience, right? So it was a really tough time to be starting the venture business, at least I thought it was, because the only companies to look at were either these things that had been started in like 1999 or 2000, these enterprise software companies that were bloated and broken and had raised at that time $60 million of capital, which seemed like a ton of money, and they were losing money and going nowhere and not growing. And so you could kind of do recaps of those, or SaaS hadn't really started yet. Salesforce had, but they didn't really raise venture capital, and so there just weren't companies that were really exciting. There was one company I wanted to invest in that was a guy who had gone to Stanford Business School at the same time I was. He was a Sloan Fellow, and it was an interesting kind of new SaaS company. And then it was called SuccessFactors, and so I tried to invest in it, and I couldn't figure it out, but I couldn't. I didn't win, the investment, and I was really young, but I didn't know why. And then I discovered later that it was because SuccessFactors was a reconstituted company. It had been a prior company called Austin Hain that was doing something similar, but not really with SaaS. But it was again serving HR departments, and I couldn't do it because Excel had been an investor in Austin Hain, and when it got recapped, Excel said, "No mas, we don't want any more. We're out." And so then when I was trying to come back and invest, and I didn't know the history, they're like, "Wait, Excel bailed on this thing. We're not letting them back in." And I didn't even know this, so for a while, so I was kind of upset. But it turned out to be a good company. But otherwise, there wasn't much to do, and so I began looking at consumer stuff because at least it was interesting. And this new set of, even though consumer internet still in the venture community was considered stupid, and there weren't really many, there've been so many disasters. No one wanted to touch most consumer stuff. And so, but I looked at a few things. So first of all, there was Friendster, right? For those of you who don't remember, Friendster was sort of arguably the first consumer social network. But it didn't have a purpose, right? You could have a profile, but there was nothing to do on there. But a lot of famous people invested in it, right? So it was sort of John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins and Bob Cagle from Benchmark. And then there was a friend of mine, who had invested in it. And then the thing kind of blew up. It was really poorly managed. They couldn't keep the site up, the site infrastructure, because at that time, they didn't understand how to design for a social graph. And so the site kept going down. And so actually what happened is that the site was only up during off hours in the US because it couldn't handle the traffic. And that was peak hours in Asia. So what happened is the site sort of got overrun by, in particular Southeast Asian users, and in particular, how do I put this? Southeast Asian users with an adult influence.
I got you.
Professionals.
Okay. I got you.
And so it got overrun with this. So we got this sort of bad name. And so social networking was thought of as this is kind of stupid. And it gets overrun with sort of, not salacious elements. And there's no purpose. So, but then a friend of mine told me about this company, MySpace. And he said, well, look, here's the deal. It's basically like Friendster, and it started in LA, except for some reason it has a lot fewer prostitutes on there. and that was how it was pitched to me. And so I said, okay, well, let me check this out. And so it was July 4th, I remember, probably 2004, I think. And I remember this because I was at my parents' house with my wife, but they were kind of gone. So I had my laptop open, and I've got Friendster and two windows, Friendster and MySpace. And I literally am trying to count the number of prostitutes or people who look like they have prostitute profiles, which I'm probably getting a lot of trouble for how do you know? And I don't remember, but somehow I was searching for that and trying to count. And then the phone rang, and I got up and left my computer. My laptop was open. My stepmom came by and saw this. And she said, "Oh my God, what?" And she didn't say anything to me though. She went to my wife and asked her if everything was okay, like in the marriage, was because she saw my laptop open and it appeared like I was on some dating site or looking at prostitutes. And so I had to explain to my wife, no, this was legitimate research. And she did not believe me, I don't think, until the Facebook investment, and then it all made sense, right? But so anyway, so MySpace, it did have fewer prostitutes, it had a lot of other things, but it was, at the time, it didn't seem like it was possible to invest. They were controlled by this weird holding company called Intermix, and so I just sort of gave up on it. Redpoint wound up figuring out how to invest, and they invested in it, and it looked like a great investment for a while. And so then Facebook came along when I heard about it from this guy who used to be an intern for us, and he was at Stanford Business School, and he heard about it at Stanford, this guy named Chiwa Chen. And he called me up, so you got to check this thing out called Facebook. It's at maybe it does 7 or 8 colleges, and it's really taking off. And I was like, well, let me look at it. And then I had to try a bunch of different ways to get introduced to, at that time, Sean Parker, who was sort of running the financing. And I had all these meetings. I would get these meetings set up with Sean Parker, and he kept canceling them with some lame excuse, like his grandmother was sick or, whatever. And then Matt Kohler was someone I had met and kept in touch with when he was like a head running business development at LinkedIn. And when he went to Facebook, I said, look, I called him up and said, I'd love to come meet. Sean's been kind of blowing me off, and this is interesting. And I'd gone to Stanford. I went to their student union and just began grabbing random students saying, have you heard of this thing called Facebook? And do you use it, and why? Or do you use it for like a couple of days and you get tired of it? And, and they're like, oh God, no. I mean, yeah, it's like taking over my life, and we're on all the time, and someone's selling t-shirts on it in the dorm, and professors were on it posting class notes. And it was like, whoa, it had these tentacles that were, taking over your life. And that's what we were looking for. That was sort of our thesis. And it was like, well, this is very different than Friendster or MySpace. There's a purpose here. It's not your weird virtual life where you're anonymous, you do weird things. This is your real life and your real relationships. And your behavior is a lot better because it's your real name. They verify it with the .edu email address from your college. So if you misbehave or post weird stuff, there's this huge societal pressure to not do that, because everyone will think you're weird in your dorm. So met with Matt, and long story short, it was a very difficult way to get the deal done, and it was very difficult to kind of get in front of Mark and Sean, and there's stories about that I won't get into, but we eventually did. And they turned down our first offer, and then we kind of gave them one they couldn't refuse, and I went back, and then it worked out. And then my partner Jim Breyer went on the board. I was still pretty young, but I was went to all the board meetings in the beginning, and it was a crazy time, and it was an interesting investment. Though I got to say, so that was 2005 when we finally invested. I think it closed in April 2005.
What was the offer that you first gave them that they rejected, and then what was the offer like? Would they accept it? I mean, I think it was, from what I heard, it was like you invested 10 million or something for 10% or something around that was the deal that you ended up closing.
It was a little better than that. To be honest, it's all documented somewhere. There's a book about all this called The Facebook Effect, where the journalist actually, not the social network, that was sort of no one cooperated with that. So there was a lot. That was sort of the Eduardo Saverin side of the story, who I never met. He was sort of, he was completely uninvolved, but this guy who wrote The Facebook Effect actually was a journalist and kind of got everyone's input. And I learned things in that book, but I think we put in 12 million at 80 pre, I think it was. Okay. And the initial deal was like 60 pre, Okay. So at that time, that was a huge leap. I mean, so paying 80 pre for a company with, really young founders, and some of them with a checkered past, Sean Parker had sort of interesting background, and Mark was a 19-year-old college student. And remember, Friendster had just blown up. No one really knew about MySpace yet. So this looked really stupid. social networking, that's really dumb by these really inexperienced founders at this really high price. And no one else wanted to do the deal. So what are they thinking? So this wasn't a competitive deal, which was weird. Nobody, they talked to everyone and were turned down by everyone except the Washington Post. So Don Graham was going to invest part of the Washington Post, but no other venture firm wanted to touch this thing. And for us, it was because we had this sort of point of view about not just consumer companies, but we had spent time with MySpace and understood Friendster, and so we had a very different view about it. And I remember once the prevailing view at that time, which sounds crazy, is that college students were a horrible demographic to advertise to because they had no money. So who would want to advertise to college students? And I found someone who had started a college student media company. And he said, yeah, that's what everyone thinks, but it's totally wrong. Because college students, now this is obvious, but this is when you get your first bank account, your first credit card, maybe you buy your first car. And so they want companies desperate to get you when you're forming these purchase habits. Like I got my first bank account in college at Wells Fargo and I still have it, right? And so they said they will pay anything to reach college students. The problem is if there's, at the time, there was no media property to reach them because college students didn't read newspapers. They didn't have TVs in their room. Internet was still pretty new. And you were so busy that they just couldn't advertise to you. And so they were like, look, if you could give me a media property that has every college student in the country on it for like 4 hours a day, you'll be able to just print money. And he turned out to be right. So I was like, no, we definitely want to do this. We could be valuation insensitive. This can be a big company. So, that's kind of what happened. But what I had no idea it would become what it became. And also, I can't say I knew at the time how smart Mark was. He was 19. He was very shy, didn't talk a lot. We kind of had a sense early on that he was running the show and not Sean Parker and Matt Kohler. Just there were little hints, like every page of Facebook said a Mark Zuckerberg production at the bottom. Like that was a copyright. So it was pretty clear that he was actually running it, but he didn't speak much in the beginning. And it didn't become apparent, honestly, until after we made the investment, how smart he was. Like he had, an incredible amount of confidence and conviction and gut feel for what he was creating. And he resisted. And, what people forget is like the first year after we invested, MySpace grew from 7-10 million users to 100 million users. Facebook went from 0 to 7. It looked like MySpace had won. They had everyone after college, they had everyone before college, they were going international, and Facebook was this little college student universe. And so Mark was under all this pressure, probably from people like me, but certainly a lot of others, to say, hey, look at what MySpace is doing. They have these sort of open profiles and you can import, embed YouTube videos and all these things and really make it more of an identity. And yours is really boring. It's sort of like this real world thing. He's like, exactly. I'm a communication utility. I'm all about communicating information really, really efficiently. MySpace is self-expression, totally different. And he knew that so early, and he was able to resist the pressure to do what MySpace did, which also entailed turning down Yahoo's offer to buy the company for $1 billion. And early on, when it looked like MySpace had won. And it turned out to be just really, really incredible. He invented the news feed. He created this platform. I mean, he was a really, really ambitious, smart guy who, hired great talent. Now, obviously, there've been a lot of challenges with the model, with Facebook and things that we can talk about at some point. But and there's a double side to being brilliant and smart and having a lot of confidence, right? Is when it's hard to recognize when aspects of your creation are causing harm. Maybe it's harder to internalize that. It's harder to take action when you've had so much success trusting your gut.